Well, welcome everyone. It's really great to see you here. I'm Angela Anderson. I work at WRI, World Resources Institute, and have been there about 4 years. I oversee our industrial decarbonization and carbon removal work, and have been thrilled to work with Holly and Alice this last year, getting ready for the publication of this landmark report. Really pleased to have you here, and welcome also to the, did I hear 600 people online? Yes. So very, very nice to see you all. Thank you for joining as well. Today we're going to hear about this groundbreaking work that Alice and Holly have been engaged in that tells us what we know about plastics climate contributions to climate and what we need to know about plastics contributions to climate. You're going to be able to download the project from a QR code at the end of the session, and we are really proud to be the institutional home for the project. Before I go on, let me say that we're really excited to have one additional speaker that's not on the agenda, and that's Senator Whitehouse, who's going to join us around 4:30. So we may run a little longer than we expected, but we're thrilled to have him speak with us. So I know that this project has really been a labor of love for Holly and for Alice, and I think they really have brought together an incredible contribution. So we're going to talk about that more with a terrific panel. So first they will tell us more about the report, Holly first and then Alice. Dr. Zhu, I should say. And then we'll have a wonderful panel for you. It includes Monica Medina, the former Assistant Secretary of State for Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs of the United States, and Arnold Distinguished Fellow at Conservation International. Other folks include
Dr. John Doherty from the Environmental Law Institute, Dr. Sweta Chakraborty. We have Zach Byrum on your staff at WRI, the esteemed Monica Medina, and Joe Banner from the Descendants Project.
And we want to invite you all to stay for our lovely reception downstairs when we finish. So thanks again for joining, and let's learn more about plastics and climate.
Thank you so much, Angela. I really want to welcome everybody, both here at the American Association for the Advancement of Science and to the over 600 people who are tuned in online. There will be a recording of this available in about a week that everybody here and online will receive, and we're happy to have you distribute that as well. So before going any further, I do want to thank quite a number of people and organizations who got us to where we are today. First of all, Angela and her incredible team at the World Resources Institute, the Environmental Law Institute, who's collaborated with us on our report, Monterey Bay Aquarium, Margaret Spring and her team. Our funders are the Climate Works Foundation and some incredible anonymous donor through the Tides Foundation. We thank you very much. And as we mentioned, we have an amazing advisory board who's been with us basically from the beginning to give us their wisdom and guidance. Joe Banner, who we're honored to have with us here today, and Doctors Dan Lashoff, Cara Lavender Law, Karen Robenheimer, also a contributor to our report at the University of Wollongong in Perth, Australia, Dr. Sarah Jean Royer, and Dr. Leah Stokes. And we also have with us here Dave Grossman of the Green Light Group, who's an incredible contributor to our report, and quite a number of other friends and supporters who have helped us enormously. So, why plastics and climate? These two problems are linked, but the connection has not been getting enough attention, and hopefully that will begin to change. There's lots of important activity that I know everybody has heard about plastics and certainly about climate change. As far as plastics, we all started hearing about plastics mostly about 8 years ago or so, when things started out, when we were seeing all these images of plastic waste piled up in ocean gyres and on beaches. So plastic waste became a big issue. And now increasingly, we're hearing more and more every day about the health impacts of plastics and also about plastic waste. So before going any further, I do want to clarify some definitions that Alice, my colleague, and I use, and that is to distinguish between plastic waste and plastic pollution. Waste is the plastic trash, the litter that we can visibly see, which we tend to think of occurring at the end of the plastic life cycle. But in fact, plastic does not have an end to its life cycle. Plastic and its impacts basically last forever because these are materials that nature cannot absorb. Pollution, however, is something that occurs throughout the entire plastics life cycle, from the very beginning of extracting the fossil fuels all the way through to what we think of as the end, but again, there is no end. And some of that pollution includes the hormone disrupting, the carcinogenic and toxic impacts from many of the over 16,000 chemicals, mostly petrochemicals, that are in plastics. So a lot of health impacts, and what is, I think, euphemistically called environmental justice impacts that we'll get to hear more about from Joe. And there's also climate pollution, and that's our subject for today. 99% of plastics on the market today are derived from fossil fuels. And some of the climate impacts do come from combustion, as is typical in other heavily fossil fuel dependent industries. But what's unique about plastic is not all of the climate impacts come from combustion. A lot of them come from the fact that the feedstocks for plastics are also from petrochemicals, but there are also other impacts that don't derive from that. So, as the demand for conventional fossil fuel products is on the wane, plastic production is expected to triple over the next 30 years. So this is one of the reasons why it's really important that we start to make the connection between plastics and their climate impacts. The fossil fuel industry looks at plastics and petrochemicals as their, quote, plan B, or as Christiana Figueres referred to it in her recent Earth Day Outrage and Optimism podcast, the long tail of the plastics and petrochemical industry. So this expansion means then that not only are all the other impacts that are associated with plastics going to grow, but also the climate impacts. And here's a really good takeaway soundbite for you all today, that even if all plastic production, use, and waste stopped today, many of the climate impacts would still continue. So what is the Plastics and Climate Project that Dr. Zhu and I formed? She and I both knew that plastics had climate impacts, and we both knew that there was very little data. And each of us independently thought, somebody should really do a lit review. Somebody should do a literature review so we can see what data exists, what does that data say, and what data is missing. So we teamed up, we actually met via LinkedIn, and here we are 2 years later, and we have done that literature review and a number of other things. We looked at close to 6,400 peer-reviewed scientific papers to see what data existed. We narrowed that down to the several hundred of the most relevant and with the most robust data. We analyzed that data to see what it tells us, and we did a gap analysis to then see where are the holes in the data. We've developed a research agenda so that the scientific community can know where to focus its research to help fill in the missing data. And we've developed policy and action recommendations. Many other people are working on recommendations to help reverse the impacts of climate change to the greatest extent possible and to help put an end to all the egregious impacts from plastics. But ours are uniquely focused on this need for spurring further research and for connecting these two issues with the goal to then be able to actually account for all of plastics' impacts on climate and for the world to then eventually be able to estimate with a good degree of accuracy what plastic's contribution to global average temperature rise actually is. So as of today, we have completed phase 1 of our work, and we're about to launch into phase 2 to share our findings and recommendations and spur that research and those actions. So some of the takeaways: plastics and climate problems and solutions are connected. There are 3 categories of impacts. we tend to focus on the greenhouse gas emissions. And that's certainly a very important category, the one where there is the most data, but still a great deal of missing data. Even with the data that we have today, plastics account for at least 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So that is equivalent to, if the plastics industry were a country, it would be the 4th or 5th largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. And we know that we are undercounting those impacts. And we'll still hear from Alice about the other 2 categories of impacts. So, as I said, we know that we're undercounting the impacts, and therefore that plastics are using up more of the carbon budget than we are currently allowing for. We do know enough to act, though. So, on that note, we are going to then move to Alice, who can explain to us about the findings in the 3 categories of impacts, and I'll leave the floor to her.
Great, thank you, Holly. Hi, everyone. So it's nice to be here. My name's Alice, and I'll be covering our scientific findings and research recommendations. So as Holly alluded to, we identified and investigated 3 major mechanisms by which plastics influence the climate: greenhouse gas emissions from the plastics life cycle, impacts to carbon sinks and carbon cycling, and impacts to Earth's radiation budget. And there are major data gaps that exist in all 3 categories. For those of you not familiar with the Earth's radiation budget, I will be explaining the concept a bit further in this presentation. And the little amount of data that we have means that we are undercounting a lot of the impacts, the true impacts of plastics on climate. One of the messages we want to bring home today is that plastics aren't just a waste problem, and that not all climate impacts are included in greenhouse gas emissions accounting, IPCC scenarios, and climate models at present. So now I will go into detail about what we found from our systematic review regarding these 3 types of impacts. The first impact category is greenhouse gas emissions from the plastics life cycle. The studies that we examined estimate that up to 2 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents are emitted from the plastics life cycle every year. This amounts to roughly 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions and is the equivalent of emissions from over 400 coal power plants of 500 megawatt electricity generating capacity. But we know that it is more than this number due to these data gaps. The highest greenhouse gas emissions come from the primary production stage, and across all waste management strategies, incineration generated the most greenhouse gases at the global level, while landfilling generated the least. But these emissions estimates vary considerably, and there is a substantial amount of missing data. This missing data means we are undercounting the greenhouse gas emissions from the plastics life cycle. For the second category of impacts, which is impacts to carbon cycling and sinks. We found that studies generally find that plastics will impact the carbon cycle in ways that increase warming. So we looked at many carbon cycling processes and what plastics could potentially do to them. But here we highlight a few of interest. So 3 processes involved in the carbon cycle, or Earth's natural processes that store carbon, that had relatively clear results are the biological carbon pump, which is the ability of the ocean to store carbon, the health of phytoplankton, microscopic plants in the ocean, and soil respiration, or how much greenhouse gases are emitted from soil. So we found from our synthesis that plastics will impact these processes in ways that increase warming for the most part, essentially exacerbating climate change. And then there are other processes that have more mixed results, specifically the presence of soil microbes that facilitate carbon storage, the health of soil biota, carbon fixation by terrestrial plants, and the health of marine zooplankton. And you can see here is an image of a zooplankton with plastic particles in its gut. So the magnitude of these effects on carbon cycling is not well understood. And before delving into the third category of impacts, I want to briefly touch upon the Earth's radiation budget. Some of you might already be familiar with this, but essentially this budget describes the balance of incoming radiation from towards the Earth's surface and outgoing radiation away from the Earth's surface, which dictates the Earth's surface temperature. And greenhouse gases are not the only factor that plays a role in this. What's also important is aerosols, clouds, and albedo. So what we found from our synthesis was that only 5 studies carried out scientific tests within this category. There is very little information available pertaining to these impacts and big unknowns. So for instance, the impact of plastics on warming or cooling effects via incorporation in clouds is unclear. And the ability of atmospheric plastics or plastic aerosols to directly affect energy exchange either has a cooling effect or no significant effect on climate. And all 6 tests pertaining to albedo or surface reflectivity found that plastics tend to increase surface reflectivity. But don't get too excited. This is expected to have a smaller magnitude of effect relative to the other 2 impact categories. And in addition, aerosols as a whole, not just plastic, have a relatively smaller magnitude of impact on global warming compared to other radiative forcing agents, such as greenhouse gases. So overall, there are large uncertainties that exist in this domain of research and in general in our understanding of clouds and how they impact climate. So I want to summarize the knowledge gaps that we've identified and the research priorities. In terms of greenhouse gas emissions from the plastics life cycle, we have an incomplete understanding of how much greenhouse gas emissions are generated across the plastics life cycle, both at the national and the global levels. We need more estimates of greenhouse gas emissions and emissions intensities across the entire plastics life cycle, in particular for stages with little to no data. So the priorities include the transportation, import-export, and the use or consumption stages, as well as the unmanaged waste stage, which is all the plastic trash in the environment, which also emit greenhouse gases when exposed to UV radiation. And plastic in the first 2 categories, they emit greenhouse gases, such as plastic windows and doors, which we typically don't think about, and also foam insulation, which is a major culprit of fluorine emissions. And also, the open burning and open dumping waste management strategies need further research. So in terms of carbon cycling processes, there are very few studies done so far on coastal blue carbon ecosystems, which play a major role in carbon sequestration around the world. So those are examples include mangroves and seagrasses. And so we need more experiments, field sampling, and modeling efforts to elucidate the impact of plastics on carbon cycling processes happening in these ecosystems, but also for the specific processes of the carbon pump and carbon dioxide drawdown into surface waters, carbon fixation by plants, and the health of marine bacteria and marine zooplankton. And finally, for the radiation budget, we have a limited understanding of how much radiative forcing plastics in air and in clouds are responsible for, and how surface plastics alter the Earth's reflectivity, or albedo. So we need more studies that investigate the extent of micro and nanoplastic contamination in the atmosphere, in clouds, ice, and snow, and how plastics are contributing to radiative forcing and temperature rise. In addition, researchers should consider reflecting the realities of pollution, so using realistic shapes, sizes, colors, and polymer types of plastic in their experiments, instead of just single polymers or one specific type of plastic, so that we're mimicking the combinations of microplastics we see in nature. And also further research should consider the climate impacts of bioplastics, which are an emerging stream of plastics. So now I will conclude by saying that we need better accounting for the impact of plastics in order to fill these existing data gaps. That way we can holistically understand the impacts of plastics on climate and examine and manage both issues together. The general direction of impacts on climate is in a warming direction for greenhouse gas emissions category and the carbon cycling category. But more research is needed. And since plastic production is expected to triple by 2060, this means that climate impacts will probably increase and worsen. So we need the scientific research in order to have the data to fully account for these impacts, know how severe they are, and ultimately know their impact on global temperature rise and inform policy. And we cannot manage what we can't measure. So with that, I'll bring it back to Holly, who will detail the actions that we recommend.
Thank you, Alice. So I think everybody can tell there's a lot of missing information here and that we're definitely undercounting the climate impacts of plastics. So what are we going to do about that? So even though we don't have complete data now, that is no reason not to take action. We need to somehow just allow for this undercounting while at the same time generating that data. So at the international level, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, should pay attention to allow for, at least consider, all of these greater climate impacts in their emission scenarios and their climate models. And we, the Plastics and Climate Project, strongly urge the IPCC to do one of their special reports on plastics, petrochemicals, and climate change. And should a scientific body emerge from the UN plastic treaty negotiations, the next and supposedly final round happening this summer, that those two bodies could coordinate on that work. As far as the UN Plastics Treaty itself, in terms of any kinds of assessments that they're doing or data generation or requiring parties to collect data, that the climate impacts of plastics should also be included. At the national and subnational levels, we certainly want the scientific research to be supported. Unfortunately, as we all know, that is not happening now in the United States in most areas of scientific research, but hopefully that will all change soon. We do want to have the climate impacts of plastics included in emissions inventories, in nationally determined contributions that are required because of the Paris Agreement to the UN Framework on Climate Change. I think Alice mentioned that only 14 countries currently have national data on plastic impacts related to climate. Also, to consider the climate impacts of plastics in climate mitigation and adaptation plans, and in natural carbon sequestration restoration efforts, because we want those to operate as effectively as they are designed. And if micro and nanoplastics are at all decreasing the capacity of natural sinks to do that job of acting as carbon sinks, we need to know about that. And also, our laws and policies, regulations need to require, to the greatest extent feasible, transparency. We need transparency from companies that are involved in making and using and processing plastics to let us know what the polymer makeups are and what the ingredients in those plastics are, in order for us to all both understand the health impacts and the climate impacts. And we understand that companies have concerns about proprietary information, but at the same time, we, the public and scientists, cannot be in the dark about these materials that we are all right now in this room and online. We are all breathing in plastics, we are sitting on plastics, we are holding plastics, we are wearing plastics. They are everywhere and they are affecting us, and we need to know what is in them. The private sector should monitor and disclose the greenhouse gases involved in the plastics that they are producing or using or processing in terms of waste, and also the release of micro and nanoplastics. Because as we heard, those are having other kinds of climate impacts. In fact, those micro and nanoplastics, many of them also emit greenhouse gases. One of the scientists on our advisory board, Dr. Sarah Jean Royer, is a scientist who discovered by accident that his polyethylene grocery bags once they've been hit by UV light, by sunlight, they break down into smaller and smaller pieces, and they emit methane and other greenhouse gases. And the more that they break down, the more surface area is exposed, and the more greenhouse gases they emit. It would be really good to know how significant that is, because there is a lot of polyethylene breaking down in the environment and other plastics. We need to include, companies need to include the climate impacts of plastics in their sustainability initiatives, targets, and reporting. And again, we really need that transparency. So, how can we act on those things? There are a lot of opportunities coming up. There are the UN plastic treaty negotiations, as I mentioned, the ongoing the ongoing climate treaty negotiations. There are lots of multilateral environment agreements that have to do with oceans, chemicals, biodiversity, and others, and the climate impacts of plastics need to be accounted for in those as well. And all of us here, our big virtual audience, scientists, consumers, we all need to help raise the awareness of the climate impacts of plastics and make the connection between these two issues. We need to be incorporating the climate impacts of plastics wherever possible, as Alice mentioned, in scenarios, in climate models, in assessments, etc. And before I go any further, I do believe it is about 4:30, excuse me. Are we ready for Senator Whitehouse? Excuse me?
We are.
We are. Then I will just say, oh, that would be the senator. Senator, I never thought of you as the man behind the curtain in Oz. I can't thank you enough for being here. I think many of you know our esteemed Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, who I truly revere because he is so outspoken on climate, on plastics, on oceans, and all environmental issues. And he is just so powerful on all of those issues. He is the ranking member of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. And I hand it over to you, Senator. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Holly. It's great to have the chance to speak with all of you. I recently was at the Our Oceans International Conference in Busan, looking at the ocean plastics issues, the ocean warming issues, the ocean acidification issues, the ocean overfishing issues. The poor old ocean has more than its share of issues. My favorite measure is the zettajoule, joule being the unit of heat energy, zetta meaning it has 21 zeros behind it. So it's a monstrously big number. The entire production of energy by the entire human species on the entire planet is half a zettajoule. And the penalty we pay for the fossil fuel component of that half zettajoule is that 14 zettajoules, which is like 7 Hiroshima detonations per second worth of heat, gets dumped into our oceans. So coasts are seeing sea levels rise, fishers are seeing fisheries moving about, coral reefs, and scuba divers are seeing reefs die. And it's really urgent that we get after that. The next thing coming up is going to be the UN Oceans Conference. There, I'm going to be asking the high ambition nations to keep working after the UNEP process concludes, because we're now guaranteed that the UNEP process will be a failure to address adequately the ocean plastics problem. But I do believe that there's more room to move forward with the high ambition nations collectively, and that they're good starting points to begin with, like the Unilever self-imposed requirement that for every kilo of plastic the company puts out into the world, it will recover and properly dispose of a kilo of plastic. If all the major plastics companies and distribution companies did that, we'd be in a completely different world. And it shouldn't be asking too much for the high ambition nations to hold corporations to a standard that one of the leading global corporations is already imposing on itself. So we have a lot of work to do, and I'm looking forward to continued progress. Unfortunately, we're going to have to deal with NOAA and USAID, which were two of our best organizations on ocean plastics, being savagely decimated by the Trumpster crowd of I call them muskrats, for want of a better word. But World Resources Institute does a terrific job. I really enjoy working with all of you, and I'm grateful for your continued advocacy and pressure, because the more that our Republican colleagues hear from their voters, the better we do. So many thanks to all, and I've got a dash.
Can't thank you enough, Senator. Thank you so much for making the time. Oh, that was fantastic. Let's give the senator some applause. We do have people in public life who still really care and are working really hard to make things better, and Senator Whitehouse is such a shining example of that. So we're very grateful to him and his staff for making that possible. So it is now my pleasure to, where did Sweta go? Yes. To hand things off to Sweta Chakraborty. She is CEO of We Don't Have Time North America and the founder of Scientista, which helps to elevate women in science. And she is going to moderate our panel and then some questions from the audience before I close with some resources for all of you. Thank you, Sweta.
Thank you. It's my absolute pleasure to be here and to moderate this panel. I'm excited to introduce, and if I can ask my panelists to please step up and take their seats. We have Monica Medina, Arnold Distinguished Fellow at Conservation International. We have, and you don't have to sit in order, it's okay. Just sit wherever you're comfortable, totally fine. We have John Doherty, Science and Policy Analyst at the Environmental Law Institute. He's also the report co-author. And we have Joe Banner, who is the founder of the Descendants project. Welcome, Joe. We have Zach Byrum, Research Associate for Industrial Decarbonization of the World Resources Institute. And of course, we have Alice and Holly. Did I miss anyone? So I'm gonna pose a question to 3 of the panelists first and give them a moment to respond, and then we'll open it up Q&A to all of the panelists. Or I believe Monica will say some words as well, and then we'll open it up for. Okay, perfect. Okay, so we're gonna get into this. So it really is a pleasure to be here. Thank you for those of you who are in the room, for those of you who are tuning in. I'm a behavioral scientist, and I can underscore everything that's been said here. From my vantage point, it's critical that we get plastics right and the communication of the risks associated with plastics, because this is a point where consumers can engage and actually understand the bigger implications of climate change and the burning of fossil fuels. It's very intangible to many. It's abstract, or it's too big, or it's too overwhelming. And that's why so many think of climate as something that is just out of touch, something that they can't necessarily make an impact on. So plastics is a real opportunity, and I just want to put that out there, that this is a product that every consumer, anyone we speak to engages with, and it's an opportunity for us on the side of science to take advantage of that and to draw in audiences to the bigger picture argument. Because if we can solve plastics, we can solve climate. And so kudos to you all for doing this really important work. And as a behavioral scientist, I think this is the driving force behind true behavioral change, worldwide behavioral change, and ultimately policy change. So with that, I'm going to start with you, John. As the co-author of this report, my question to you is, what is the report's significance in light of the forthcoming global plastics and climate negotiations?
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's been truly a delight from us at the Environmental Law Institute to be able to participate in this project. In terms of how this touches on ongoing international threads, I think Holly raised both of them in her remarks. Of course, we have the resumption of the negotiations around the Global Plastics Treaty coming up in August to develop an international legally binding instrument to end plastic pollution. And if you look at the draft text from where that left off, there wasn't any explicit mention of climate in it. But there is sort of a nod for that treaty to work together in tangent with existing environmental agreements at the international stage, so like the Paris Agreement, right? And so I kind of see this report, and I'm hopeful that it can play this role in sort of bridging the communications gap between plastics and climate treaties and help inspire sort of the climate community to think a little bit more about plastics and vice versa. The other thing that's happening at the international stage, of course, that's always happening, is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 7th assessment cycle that it's entering into now. most folks in the room and online will likely know the IPCC as the organization that produces those massive comprehensive assessment reports around climate science, its impacts and solutions to climate change. It also, as Holly flagged, produces sort of smaller assessment reports on special topics. So 2 of them have been on warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. Another one has been on a special report on the oceans and the cryosphere. And one of the calls for policy action that we lay out in the report is to essentially ask the IPCC to think carefully about this plastics issue, right? Get a handle on not only the emissions that are embedded within its full life cycle, but the climate impacts that might likely happen after the life cycle and beyond the life cycle, right? So impacts on the carbon cycle, as Alice flagged, impacts perhaps on the radiation budget. Ultimately, this report, is about sort of what we know and what we don't know. So there are a lot of conclusions that end with like, well, we need more research. But I think if one thing is clear from this report, takeaway that I take away from it is that these issues aren't separate, and they're often viewed that way on the international level. And so I think we can kind of push to get the folks in the climate and plastics international policy worlds to talk to each other a little bit more.
Very well said. Exactly. We need to talk about plastics globally, multilaterally, but then also we need to think about how this work is relevant locally. And so, Joe, I'm going to come to you. As John addressed the aspect of global relevance, can you discuss the work of communities near plastics and petrochemical facilities and how to draw local communities into this bigger picture, so bottom up and top down?
So the question is, how do we bring in local communities into this fight against plastic? For me, it's not so much of bringing in the local community, it's how do I stop my local community from being exploited by plastic production and by the brands who continue to use plastic. Plastic is not, we don't look at it as a problem to be solved, we just want it stopped, because we really don't have time for the solutions to plastic. We want it to be eliminated. And so and by the way, I'm in St. John the Baptist Parish. I'm in Louisiana. I'm in an area that my family has been a part of for over 300 years. I'm 10th generation in that same community. I have a deep love for the history and the culture and the heritage, but it comes with some stains. And part of our existence in this area is that we are descendants of the enslaved. My area, because of the environmental justice issues that stem from the system of slavery, we're now facing the system of petrochemical and other pollution, but plastic production pollution that makes us, our area known as Cancer Alley. And St. John and Baptist Parish has one of the highest cancer risks in the country. So we're dealing with all of these issues that stem from a system of enslavement, and the plastic production are in the literal footprints of plantations. So we look at it from that side of it. We are experts in plastic, and we never asked to be. It's just the conditions that we are forced upon and the health conditions that come from that. So just speaking frankly, we don't have time for those solutions. We don't have time to make this work. We know that it's failed us so often. And what my local community wants is for someone to finally listen. We're tired, we are hurting, we're suffering, we're struggling. And on top of that, we're also dealing with horrible climate conditions. In 2021, my community was hit with Hurricane Ida, which I think was categorized as a 3, but for me it was a 4 because I wrote it out. And if you've never gone through 16 hours of a hurricane just roaring and the rains and everything and tornadoes, it's horrible. But then to think of our community that's sick at the same time, when you're on pain medication from cancer, or dealing with asthma, or dealing with all those other conditions, and then your lights are out for 3 weeks, you don't have water, you're a breathing machine, you can't plug it in because you don't have electricity. So our local community, we don't need another problem to solve. We just need someone to be a partner with us to help us at least eliminate this problem that continues to be a plague to our community, and to finally let go of those false solutions. We can't recycle our way out of this. That's a false solution. It still keeps up the production. It still keeps the toxins in our communities. And so we have to just get away from those solutions that we know that don't work, and find things such as actually stopping and reusing other items besides that. This is what our communities are are seeking.
Joe, can you just also please, you've given me the number before of the percentage of people in your community that have cancer. What is that number? Isn't it about that you're in the 99th percentile?
Yeah, so our cancer risk, we're in a 99, some areas in the 99th percentile of cancer risk, and most the general was the 95th percentile of cancer risk. So Cancer Alley is an area between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. It's an 85-mile stretch, and in that area, there's 200 different plants that are involved in the production of plastic in some way, shape, or form. I think actually it may be more, but it's just to show you that intensity of that corridor. And that matches because of the plantation system. So you can do an overlay of the plants and the former plantations, and you see that those same grounds are being used. And in addition, the burial grounds of the enslaved who were on those plantations and had no other choice, they're there too. So these plants they own plantations and they also own slaves because that's what's on their ground. So that's the harsh reality of this plastic that we are talking about.
Thank you for sharing that so candidly. We've had Rev Yearwood on our We Don't Have Time broadcast, and he's talked a lot about this. We want to get that story out there because it's so important to talk about, eliminate it because of the historical context of this, just to be fair, but then also this is fundamentally linked to, and this isn't intuitive or obvious for many, but it's linked to oil, right? There's a Veep episode, season 1, where one of the staffers said, if you piss off plastics, you're gonna piss off oil. So how do we tell that story and make that connection? And Zach, I'm gonna come to you to ask you this question, because we're talking about plastics here, but there is a bigger picture. It is petrochemicals. That's the main ingredients in plastics. So how is all this conversation about plastics linked to the petrochemical industry and the broader big picture of how big oil and gas has systematically discriminated against vulnerable communities in the United States and around the world? That might come back to you, Joe, but to throw it to you first, Zach.
I'll defer the latter half to Joe. Well, I want to take it back to a point that was mentioned in the slideshow earlier, which was that 99% of plastics and chemicals are petrochemicals. They come from fossil fuels. In the US, they come from natural gas. And there's been this idea of plastics and chemicals and petrochemicals being a lifeline should the economy decarbonize away from fossil fuels and transportation. Well, we have the infrastructure still. We can continue to use oil to make plastics. But what I think this does is preempt the defense of that argument. I think there's this implication, and I've heard this implication, this insistence by chemical companies that, well, if we're not burning the oil and gas from underground, it's locked into the plastic. It's inert. It's sequestered. But as we see, these products are shedding greenhouse gases. They're shedding CO2. They're shedding methane. They're shedding toxins and biochemicals that disrupt the soil and the water. These are not inert products. And so this idea that, well, we're not burning it, so it's not bad, well, maybe not putting it in the atmosphere immediately, but we're creating this encroaching, perhaps slow-moving, but steadily moving molasses of GHGs coming at us every single year. They talk about the methane bombs in Siberia, permafrost. This is, I think of it as kind of the molasses bomb of just steady emissions from plastic products. It also preempts this idea that, well, okay, if we defossilize plastic production, such as by taking away natural gas feedstocks and replacing it with, for example, captured CO2 from the atmosphere or from flue stacks, and then combining that with hydrogen, if we defossilize it, it's not so bad because we're not taking underground carbon and putting it in the air. And then we're gonna maybe even remove CO2 because we're taking it from the atmosphere, turning it into a plastic, and then locking it in the plastic. Well, no, you're not, again, because it's going to go back into the atmosphere eventually, and it's going to cause a lot of harm to the environment in the meantime. You're going to be worse off than if we had never made it in the first place. So at the end of the day, the best solution we have is to reduce demand, to stop using plastics, and if we are going to use them for maybe the only most essential applications. I'm not the expert on which ones are the most essential ones, but at the end of the day, reducing demand is the best solution for this.
Absolutely, well said. Okay, so I'm going to turn to my co-host for the Scientista podcast, which Holly mentioned is a new organization all about supporting women to lead with science. So Monica's the co-host for that. Please check out some of our episodes. And I would love to get Monica's thoughts on this topic broadly and some of the comments that the panelists have made.
Thank you so much. And it is really a testament to the hard work over the last few years that this report has come to be. And it's about time. It's about time that we started to connect these dots. And as someone who worked in the government for part of my career in NGOs and philanthropy, we know now that the planet is being hammered by plastic. We are just overwhelmed with it. It is everywhere on the planet. Everywhere, from the deepest part of the ocean to the tallest mountain, from the tip of the land masses and in the ice in the Arctic all the way down to the Antarctic. And I'll tell a story that another one of our Scientista friends told about a Navy operation that had gone to the North Pole in a submarine and popped up and was able to stand on the ice, and the naval operators were able to stand on the ice and hit golf balls. Probably not the best thing for the environment, but not a big impact. But they could stand on the ice 20 years ago, and now they pop up, they can't stand on the ice, and what they see is plastic. It's everywhere. And so what are we going to do about this? I mean, we are talking about, and again, Holly, maybe I've got these numbers wrong. Maybe they're too low, but 400 million tons of plastic produced annually, and none of it is recycled. It all ends up in the environment somewhere. It all is still in the environment. Every bit of plastic that has ever been made, and you said this, it's here, it's all around us, it's in the room. Every bit of it that's ever been made is still with us on this planet, and we've only had it for a few decades, and yet we are overwhelming our planet, and it will be with us for centuries, forever, for all intents and purposes, forever. We talk about forever chemicals that are made, that are in plastics, but really plastic itself is forever. And if we think about climate change and how we want to make a difference on climate change and how we're working so hard with the IPC to try and figure out how to stay not too far above 1.5 or 1.8 degrees or 2 degrees Celsius in warming. The reason we can't actually get our arms around it is because we're undercounting major things like this. So, and the statistics that you brought out about the amount that plastic is still increasing, our production is still increasing. Zach, you talked about how we need to get it under control. We are nowhere close. It is meant to triple in the next few decades. So, takeaways from this report that really struck me were the fact that it's a huge part of the carbon budget already. Like it's as much as, what did you say, the fourth or fifth largest emission. So, it is a huge part of this climate problem that we need to get our arms around, and the IPCC should be getting its arms around. I spent a lot of my time on nature and biodiversity, and plastic in nature is a huge, I think, wake-up in this report. There's a huge wake-up call about the impacts of plastic on nature and how it disrupts natural systems, and that too has a huge impact on climate. And then the radiation budget that you talked about, the fact is we just don't even know. We don't know nearly enough about how that's impacting us. So what do? Obviously, we need state and local governments here in the US to take action, and that's where everyone can really go to their state and local politicians and demand change. I mean, you can see it in your own wastebasket, right? Like your own trash can at home. You see what we are doing to the environment every day, and I think Americans are sick of it. I really do. I think, we need to take this moment and things like this report and take them to heart. We also do need federal standards and more support of the federal government. And I know there's been a lot of focus on straws. And if you focus only on plastic straws, you're kind of missing the point. Yes, it's a little bit about straws. Straws are the tip of the plastic iceberg, and they are a symbol of what our dependence looks like. but really it's so much bigger than straws. And I want to take a moment and talk about the international agreement, the agreement that you've all mentioned that's being negotiated now. I was at the UN meeting where we decided to negotiate this agreement, and I'll never forget it. The chair of the agreement was the then environment minister of Norway. He's now the foreign minister. And he said, with tears in his eyes, I really didn't understand the impacts, but I'm a scientist, so I tested myself. And the amount of plastic in my own bloodstream was so alarming. I cannot implore this body enough to take up the agreement and to start to negotiate. And so we did. So yes, we need a plastic agreement, but that's not enough. We need it now. And I will say this is probably controversial, but I will speak my mind, because what's the point of being at a place like this if you don't say what you really think? I would love a treaty, but if it takes too darn long to have a treaty, we should have a really tough agreement on how to curb plastics and get going right now. I think Joe's call to action couldn't be more clear. We don't have 10 years to wait to finish negotiating this agreement and have it enter into force. We need action now. And we cannot think of it as disposable. We need to reframe our vision of what plastic is. It is forever. Forever. Plastics are a tax that we are putting on communities like Joe's and on everyone who's consuming it now in their food supply, our own children, ourselves, and on future generations. So if we don't really think about the fact that we are taxing future generations for the privilege of throwing away a plastic water bottle, we are missing the point.
Nice. Fantastic framing, Monica. That's exactly the kind of illustrations that if we could do as a community of scientists a little bit better, create that visualization, we could see actual behavioral change. So I'm going to now open it up to the audience, and please raise your hands. I think we have a mic to pass around. Yes, excellent. And while you're thinking through, I'm going to go back to Joe with that question that I had attached to Zach's. So how do you think more broadly about the petrochemical fight, right? So obviously we're talking about plastics here, but as a community, how do you stand up to such a massive, massive, well-funded organization?
That's a great question. And one of the ways that we are standing up is with the information that you all have worked so hard to deliver to us today, with that data and a data set, and knowing that we don't have all of the answers, and the petrochemical companies also don't have the answers, or at least they're not being very forward with the answer. So when we have these proposed projects coming to our communities, and we're hearing about all of the jobs that they're going to create and all the money that they're going to bring, we know that they're not even accounting for the impacts to the climate, the billions of dollars that a storm could cause, or mitigating or mediation for a storm. So using that information, and really our EJ leaders, which by the way are just community members who live there, but now we're advocates, right? Because we just want to live in peace and health. But we often laugh because now our conversations, we sound like scientists, or we sound like economists, or we sound like all these different like researchers, because that's what our body of knowledge, or we're getting information from the people we work with, and we're trying to communicate that to our elected officials, who seem to not either, like, they continue to ignore that information. So we push back with information that we receive from everyone, and also just the lived experience of our community members and their wisdom, which they often have but aren't listened to in these different settings. So having all of that, but really we have been able, one of the most important words out of all of the big multiple syllable words that we have to hear now, but the most important word that we tell our community is no. To say no from the beginning. You have the right to say no and stand firm in your no. And that is what the petrochemical companies and the other polluters, that is the most powerful thing to them. That's what they're most afraid of, our voice. And once we realized that they were coming back at us with really, honestly, petty tactics and lies, we knew that if we could just stay firm with that, and we could go into their face and say, you're lying. I'm not going to believe all of these, the marketing, the brochures, and the numbers that you have conjured up. We know what we see, and we are going to stay firm in that. So just being able to say no and encouraging our community members to stand up is powerful.
Fantastic. Thank you. Okay. Questions from the audience. Let's start right here. No, go ahead. Yes.
Thank you. This has been an amazing.
And please just say your name
Yeah,
and
I'm
organization.
Kim Warner from Oceana. I think about all the destruction that's happening right now on our science infrastructure and everything else, and how expensive it is to go out and collect the kind of data in clouds and in the ocean to kind of study these problems. How do you think that we can, circumvent those problems of funding, especially even in the trade flows and things where there is no transparency? I mean, is that something that should be addressed at the treaty level, or is there some other? I know that the funding aspects are part of that conversation, but I just see the dismantling of science and trying to get to these unanswered questions as being a very expensive proposition, and how can we act? Well, you get certainty to act at the treaty level before you have anything more firm about how it affects the carbon cycle or something like that. So that's kind of my wide-ranging question. Thank you.
Who would like to take that?
I can take a first shot. Is this working? Yep. That's a great point and a great question. I don't mean to say this to downplay the loss to American science, because it is significant. But that said, I think we wrote this report very much with the eye towards being international, and there's a lot of great science that happens outside of the US that can carry this forward. So Alice is up in Newfoundland, Canada. I myself, in a former life, did a PhD in oceanography overseas in Hong Kong. So there's a lot of great international science outside of the US that hopefully will be resilient and able to carry the work forward in the meantime while we figure things out here at home.
Yeah, I just want to underscore the answers that have already been given. But I mean, the scale of funding is quite large, but and I do think that's where governments come into play. When I was working on other scientific issues before, I managed to get scientists in other countries to raise money from their own national academies of sciences, and then that got our U.S. Academy of Science to then put in money. And I also think that philanthropy does have a role. I think philanthropy is, very, very hard to deal with, as we've learned from just doing this project, because their goals and strategies are constantly under review and changing, and it just takes a very long time. But philanthropy does really need to come together and deal with climate to the extent that it can, and it too needs to integrate the plastics elements of climate change.
Thank you, Holly. Okay, so a few more hands. Right behind you, Min.
What I heard in your descriptions about the analysis that you did was, I love the framework that you presented, and here's what we think we know directionally. And then we need lots more research in order to be able to quantify these numbers. And it just seems like lots of times when there's a new research question, especially one that spans different disciplines, different geographies, there's an initial paper or two that brings together these numbers in, yeah, these are rough, but they're the best we've got now. And I'm wondering if you were able to do that in the report, or whether you found something else that has done it, or whether you were able to estimate the amount of effort that it would take to put that together, not in the multi-year UN IPCC cycle, but in 3 months. That something would be with the right amount of philanthropic support and the right 5-author team, they could put together a rough, but here's our numbers that we can go with from there. How far were you able to get with that kind of exercise?
Do you want to start that, Alice, and then I'll say something?
Oh, yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. I think that if we want to have like a concrete number, yeah, we need like team and money. Yeah. But yeah, for this report, it really was focusing on not just what we know, but also the gaps. And since there's such a huge number of gaps. I don't think that number exists right now, but we are doing the best with what we can in terms of what we know.
But we'd be happy to think about that with some funding. I actually will be talking about what our next phase is, and we do have several scientific institutions who are very interested in carrying out some of this research, and that does require funding. These are private, nonprofit organizations or academic organizations, and we'd love to be able to get them to do some of this. I think I may have neglected to say, when I was speaking about trying to incorporate these impacts into models, scenarios, et cetera, that I like to use the analogy of a periodic table. Can somebody remind me if I said that or not? I did not. Well, then, perfect time right now. Thank you very much. So I credit my daughter with this analogy. But I think what we need to do right now, since we don't have hard numbers, is just to make room for those numbers. So the analogy is the periodic table. When scientists were discovering elements, they knew that they would discover more. And when they developed the periodic table, they purposely left blank squares because they knew they would discover more. So we need to do something like that, which is to put in those blank squares in the emission scenarios, in the NDCs, et cetera, so that there's an at least allowance for knowing that there are uncounted impacts, and not only from plastics, this is also the case in the forestry and certain other sectors. But we need to leave those blanks and not just say that the calculations we have now for getting to, or not grossly exceeding 1.5 degrees C, that we know that there's undercounting going on, and we need to make an allowance for that.
Thank you. Yes, hand behind Min.
Hi, Carl Hausker with World Resources Institute. Great to see Holly as a senior fellow with us, leading this project along with with Alice. I have a question based on WRI's model of count it, change it, scale it, and you guys have begun the counting process. Let me move to solutions, kind of as Monica was alluding to, and how we have to scale it. I know nothing about plastics, so I'm gonna make some analogies to water conservation, where it turns out, agriculture is the huge use of water, and kind of what urban areas did was not a big part of it. Or you look at power production, we started with coal plants because it was the most intense GHG emitter in power production. You can make analogies to other environmental problems where you can apply an 80-20 rule or a 90-10 rule. So when we come to plastics, there's probably thousands of types of plastics with thousands of applications. Where do you start? Is there a sector where we can apply the 80-20 rule, or a type of plastic that either biodegrades or does not biodegrade in a way that exacerbates problems? Any kind of initial thinking on where we start on a massive problem?
I don't have a precise answer, because one of the most difficult parts of plastics is that they are so absolutely disaggregated. With the coal plant issue, you can say, we see every single coal plant. We have a good idea of what they're emitting and how much power they're making. With plastics, we have thousands upon thousands, as you mentioned, and they go to so many disaggregated uses that it's hard to even identify, for example, an end consumer that you could target and say, you know what, we know that you make up 30% of the market share of purchasing this kind of plastic. What if we pointed you in a different direction? So I have such a hard time even knowing where to start when it comes to which kinds, but to go maybe up the value chain, this is more so an emissions reductions perspective than a waste reduction or a plastic reduction. But we can start with the primary chemicals that are the basis for all plastics and chemicals. You have 8 primary chemicals through which 70,000 different products must start. And they're the most carbon intensive part of making a plastic or a chemical product. So if you can reduce emissions there, or find substitutes maybe a little past that stage, then we can start to get at that problem. But from a demand side, from a consumer side, it's a tough question, and I'm working on that right now. I don't have an answer for it.
Yeah, it's a really tough ask, as Zach said. But I know that in the Global Plastics Treaty, one of the things that they're negotiating, hopefully they haven't taken it out, is the cap on production. And a lot of scientists are advocating for that because the analogy with climate science is that, in the Paris Agreement, they weren't allowed to use oil and fossil fuels and gas. They could only mention emissions. And now the world is realizing that we need to focus on the fossil fuels itself. So in parallel with plastic, instead of focusing on emissions, I think the more upstream we go, the less adverse impacts they generate. So I think that's like one of the things that I hope doesn't get scrapped from the plastics treaty is a cap on production. But yeah, as upstream as you go, I think we can really try to reduce those adverse impacts.
Oh, did you have something, Monica?
Yeah, just one quick add-on. And it is a hard one because it's hard to cap something that you don't actually have a full count on, which is the biggest challenge. But Carl, that's a great question. I would add single use. Thinking about where are the things that we put into the environment that are going to last so long that we use for such a short amount of time? And is there something we can do about those uses? That's to me, and certain dyes that we know are very toxic. If we could just, get to clear plastic even, that would be better. So.
Yeah, I think that, people often ask me, well, what should we do about plastic if we can't entirely just stop making it right away, which is not realistic. And I do think we have to focus on the products that are the most durable. You want your airplane parts to last for a long time. But I think, everybody in this room and the hundreds of people listening here, we didn't grow up with nearly as much plastic as we have now. And there's so much plastic that is completely unnecessary. When you went to the grocery store and bought apples or bananas, they weren't in plastic, and we all lived just fine. So there's a whole lot of unnecessary plastic we can just get rid of. So it's not just on the consumer side, right? It's also on the supply side. And the suppliers need to stop supplying so much, and we need to force them to do that. So yes, we need to focus on the products that we need to have really last a long time and for which there is no other substitute or that we can't do without. But there's a lot that we can do without. And in the meantime, there is a lot of excellent green chemistry going on to try to develop alternatives to plastics where it is useful to use plastic, right? But there's a lot of work being done in making things out of seaweed, out of mushrooms, et cetera. So for where we need certain things, we can make it out of benign products, and that then hopefully we can start to replace those other longer-term durable items. And with that, I think we're going to say thank you so much to our panel, and I will just share a few resources with you, and then we can close. Oops. Great. Okay, so just before we wrap up, there at long last is the QR code to everything, to information about the Plastics and Climate Project, to our report with that gorgeous cover there, and to the scientific paper that we published last month. So our report is a summary of the scientific peer-reviewed paper, but it's a summary report for non-technical audiences. So they're basically the same publication, but one for the scientific and technical community and one for all the rest of us. We do, as we've said, have a lot more work to do. We really want to be sharing our findings and recommendations widely. We will count on all of you to help do that, push things out through social media, share the recording that you'll all receive. I mean, feel free to share anything here. And we need funding to carry out this outreach campaign to work with the scientific institutions that are interested in carrying out some of this science, and to maintain another resource that we've developed that I mentioned briefly, which obviously this slide is not meant for you to read, but it's just for you to see a sample page of the online repository that we've created. So while we were doing this work, we continued to collect all of the reports, articles, et cetera, papers that we could find that have to do with the plastics and climate nexus, divided by impact category. There's links to all of the publications with keywords and a quick summary. We would like funding to be able to continue to maintain this, and anybody could go to our website at any time, including the IPCC in preparing the special report, but any of you and your colleagues who are interested in picking up on any of the points that we've been covering today. So with that, I cannot thank everybody who's here in person enough, and our huge online audience around the world, all of our wonderful speakers, WRI, my incredible daughter, who I couldn't have done this without, and of course, my wonderful colleague, Alice. Thank you for everything, and our entire team. Thank you so much.